Hey everyone, Angus Wong here. When I first started this channel about a year ago, I did it because I wanted to share my experiences in the journey of astrophotography, and I also wanted to share the knowledge that I've learned on my own with everybody else because I think that in this hobby, it can be a little bit convoluted, a little bit complicated to get started. And then I realized that as of late, some of my content have been sort of getting away from that basic idea of how things work. So I want to take a moment to sort of go back to that route and talk about a very important topic, especially right now during the winter season for the northern hemisphere. There are so many beautiful emission nebulae for us to image in the northern hemisphere that I feel like it's important to talk about filters. And I see this question a lot, like, what filter should I get? Well, here's my thinking. Instead of listening to some random person on the internet telling you what filter to get, I think it would be better for you guys, especially if you don't know which filter to get, to learn how filters work so you can use that knowledge and pick and choose your own filter based on your need and based on the objects that you want to image. So with that, let's talk about how filters work for one-shot color camera. So let's start with why we need to use a filter. There are three main reasons why somebody might want to use a filter. Number one, to help control some of the local light pollution, especially if you're living in a very light polluted city like I am. And the number two reason is some of these filters, they can provide additional contrast for your image by sort of filtering out some of the background stuff, for lack of a better phrase. And the third and final reason that I think why filters are so valuable is that depending on the filter that you choose, you can selectively limit and allow very specific wavelengths along the visible light spectrum to pass through and hit your camera sensor. Before I continue on with this video, I want to stress that what I'm going to talk about in this video will only apply to one-shot color camera. Now, I will not be covering monochrome imaging or monochrome filter, simply because number one, I don't do monochrome imaging, not right now at least. And number two, I think that if you're a beginner, using common DSLR or even dedicated astrophotography camera that is still one-shot color camera, it'll save you a lot of money, it'll save you a lot of complexity, and it's just a good way to get started in the hobby, especially if you're using a common DSLR. So everything I'm going to talk about in this video will only apply to one-shot color camera. Okay, so before you actually pick and choose your filter, you need to pick and choose your target first, because what you image will ultimately decide what filter you're going to be using. And I'll start with broadband filters first. If you want to use a broadband filter, these are going to be best applied to broadband targets, such as reflection nebulae and galaxies. The reason for that is because these targets, they have a lot of natural light coming, and they don't actually emit their own light. A lot of times, especially for reflection nebulae, they're actually, like the name suggests, reflecting starlight, nearby starlight, and they're basically just random dust in space. So, for those reasons, you want to make sure that if you're imaging a broadband target such as M45 Pleiades, Rho Ophiuchi, or even galaxies, that you use a broadband filter. Now, on top of that, depending on your location, if let's just say that you're lucky enough to be imaging from a location Bortle 5 and below, I would say to not even use the filter, based on personal experience, because border 5 and below, you don't have enough light pollution for the filter to actually block out. But instead, that very filter will still block out some of the natural blue light coming from your objects. So it's not all that beneficial, because you're, one way or another, a broadband target will cut out some of your natural blue light. However, if you're imaging from border 5 and above, then it would make sense to use a broadband filter, because you have enough light pollution where it's still beneficial for you to use a broadband filter, even though if you're cutting off a little bit of that blue light. So if you're imaging broadband targets, use a broadband filter. Now, during the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, we have a lot of emission nebulae, and this is what I personally love to image. And the reason why is because they are able to emit their own light, and for one-shot color camera astrophotographers, we're primarily concerned with two very specific wavelengths, and that would be the HA emission at 656 nanometers, and then oxygen 3 at about 500 nanometers. And in order to get those very specific wavelengths to show up, yes, a broadband filter will still work. But if you use a dual band narrowband filter made for one-shot color camera, you're able to essentially block out every single wavelength along the visible light spectrum, and only allow that very small region where 656 nanometers and 500 nanometers corresponds along the visible light spectrum to actually come through your filter and hit your camera sensor. So that is the reason why, if you're imaging emission nebulae, you're much better off at choosing a dual band narrowband filter for one-shot color camera. Okay, so now I kind of want to go into the meat of this video, and for the rest of the video I will be using Optolong filters, simply because I own them, I've used them a lot, so I can speak about them a little bit better. But most of what I'm going to say will apply to any filter that you choose. And I want to show you guys how to read a spectrum graph off a filter, because if you can understand what the graph is telling you, then you don't need to just take somebody's words on what filter works best. You can pick and choose the filter that you want to use based on what you need and based on what kind of target you want to image. So let's get going with that. Okay, so let's start with a spectrum graph for a broadband filter first. Now on the screen I am using, or I'm not using, I'm showing you the Optolong L Pro filter. This is their broadband filter. Now this is going to read a little bit intimidating if you don't have a good understanding, or if this is your first time looking at such a graph, but I can assure you that it's really easy to read. So all you need to do, number one, is orient yourself with what the graph is telling you, with the graph axes. And this is, you should be doing this anytime you read a graph. So on the very bottom, on the x-axis, you have the visible light spectrum spread out in nanometers. I believe that it's going to start at around 400 nanometers, and then which is going to be your purple violet, near ultraviolet, all the way to 700 nanometers, which is going to be your red, deep red, and near infrared. And then along the y-axis, on the very left, well, my left of the chart, you're going to have transmittance percentage. Basically, if it says 0, then none of that wavelength is coming through. If it's at 100%, then all of that photons in that wavelength will be coming through. So now that we've oriented ourselves with, with the x-axis and the y-axis, we can now read the graph. So here, if we follow the red line, the red line is telling you what the filter is allowing through and what the filter is blocking out. So if we look at the peaks of the red line. They're just sort of like these like mountain peaks or sort of like high plateaus. These are the regions along the visible light spectrum that the filter is allowing through. Now, if we look at the dips or the valleys, which will tell you that, for example, if you look along, sorry, I'm reading my TV screen far ahead so I can have an idea what I'm talking about. So hopefully I can see that right because the TV is kind of far away from me. But, you know what, 1 second. Okay. Hi, I'm back. So, if you sort of look at the graph along the 450 nanometers, to the left of it, there's a dip in the chart, and that's near zero transmittance. So what that's telling you is that at that wavelength, virtually nothing is coming through. That this filter is blocking all that photons along that range of wavelength out of the filter. So your camera is not registering it. So let's take a look at the other colors on this graph. The yellow lines that you see are actually the wavelengths that are corresponding to artificial light, such as street lamps and various other city sky glow. And if you look at those yellow lines, you will see that most of the yellow lines corresponds to a dip in the red graph, in the red line. So what that's telling you is that those wavelengths corresponding to artificial sky glow and artificial lamp are actually being blocked out by this filter. If they're not being blocked out, then only a very small percentage is being allowed through. The next thing I want to show you guys would be the green lines. Now, the green lines are actually wavelengths that are commonly corresponding to signals coming from the night sky. These are going to be your deep sky object wavelengths. And you can see that most of those signals corresponds with the red line, which has either a mountain peak or a high plateau. What that's telling you is that the filter is allowing a lot of that photons along those wavelengths to come through. If I look at the graph, I think it says like 90% transmittance to maybe even 98% transmittance, depending on which region along the visible light spectrum you're looking at. So if you can read this chart for a broadband filter, then you can know exactly what wavelengths are being blocked out and what wavelengths are being allowed through. So this is why a filter such as the Optilon L Pro is a really good broadband general purpose light pollution filter, because it's blocking out all the yellow lines which are corresponding to street lamps and various other city light pollution, and it's allowing all the green lines which corresponds to wavelengths and signal from your favorite deep sky object. Okay, so if you're still with me and you were able to get through a spectrum graph of a broadband filter, then the rest of this video will be really easy for you. But you know what? Practice makes perfect, right? So we're gonna look at a few more examples of filter. The next set of filters I'll be talking about are the very, very popular dual band narrowband filter for one-shot color camera. And I'm going to be using the Optilon L Enhance in this example. And once again, let's orient ourselves with the chart first. So on the very bottom, the x-axis, we're going to have the visible light spectrum in nanometers. And along the y-axis, my far left, would be the percentage transmittance, how much light is coming through. So now that we once again have oriented ourselves with the graph, we can pay attention to the white lines here. The white lines are the transmittance line, I'm sorry, transmittance line for the optical L enhanced. And you'll notice that this reads much simpler than the broadband version because there are only essentially two peaks, two of them. And those two peaks surround two very specific wavelengths that we are concerned with when it comes to emission nebulae. And that would be hydrogen alpha along the sort of, I guess, my right, at around 656 nanometers, and then a green line corresponding to oxygen 3 at around 500 nanometers. Now, you'll see that there's a hydrogen beta line in the faint blue right next to the O3. We're not going to be concerned about that because I don't even know why Optilon decided to put that that pass-through right there, because hydrogen beta doesn't really amount to much when it comes to imaging. So we're just going to ignore that. For this purpose, we're only going to be concerned with hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3. Now, let's take a look at the transmittance line again. If you've noticed, it's far less complicated than the broadband version. And the reason for that is because we're not concerned with anything else aside from hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3. So they can design the filter to essentially block everything out along the visible light spectrum. That is why, aside from those two peaks, this filter basically has 0% transmittance for everything else along the visible light spectrum. But if you look at the peaks around hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3, it has about 90% of transmittance for 656 nanometers, which would be your hydrogen alpha, and 500 nanometers, which would be for oxygen 3. So this is why a dual band narrowband filter for one-shot color camera is really well suited, because especially if you live in a very light polluted city like I am, a filter like this is wonderful because it's blocking out every single light source around me aside from what I'm concerned with when it comes to emission nebulae. And that would be hydrogen alpha once again and oxygen 3. Okay, we're on the home stretch now. Now that you've understand how a dual band narrowband filter works, let's answer the question, why would somebody want to choose a narrower dual band narrowband filter? And when I say that, I'm referring to the bandpass, basically the peaks along the transmittance graph, and why you want something that has a narrower bandpass. And that essentially has to do with light pollution. So in this example, I'll be using the Optilon L Extreme filter, and as you can see, it has a very similar graph compared to the Optilon L Enhanced. The only real difference is that the regions around hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3, in the example for L Extreme, it's much narrower. I believe, based on the specs, the L Extreme has a bandpass of 7 nanometers width along hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3. Compare that to the Optilon L Enhanced, which I believe has a hydrogen alpha bandpass of about 10 nanometers, and then an oxygen 3 bandpass of around, I think 30 nanometers. And the real difference between the two is that the L Extreme, it's able to restrict even more of that light pollution because that bandpass, it's much narrower. You may not think that as much, like for example, hydrogen alpha between 10 nanometers of the L Enhanced and the 7 nanometers of the L Enhanced, sorry. But it's a lot, And also if you compare between the oxygen 3 region, 7 nanometers of L extreme compared to 30 nanometers around the oxygen 3 in L enhanced, that is a massive difference, especially you want to image under the full moon, because the full moon is going to have a lot of that blue light, and guess what? The optical L extreme is able to cut off a lot of blue light. It doesn't mean you're immune from the moon, it'll just help you better to image if you really need to image under the full moon. So I also want to stress that by going with a narrower filter, such as the optical L extreme, you're not collecting any more hydrogen alpha or O3 photons. Between the two filters, you're collecting the same amount of filter, but what you're doing effectively is by using a narrower bandpass, such as the L extreme, you're restricting more of that light pollution. So in a sense, you're kind of purifying your signal, because less of that, less of the wavelengths around, say, hydrogen alpha is coming through. Less of the wavelength around oxygen 3 is coming through. So that is why people pay more money for narrower band passes, because it helps control the light pollution even more, and it helps sort of purify your data, essentially. Okay, so we made it to the very end of this rather boring video, and I thank you all for sticking with it, because I can't image right now. My new place is not set up. I have a hard time getting furniture. This is probably the only thing that's set in stone. But I hope that a video like this is going to be beneficial and helpful to those of you who are starting out in this hobby, or those of you who are trying to get that next upgrade to your set of gear. Because I think that this is more powerful or more valuable to you if you are able to understand how and why things work. You put the two together, and then you can go out and pick and choose your equipment based on what you want and what you need, not some random person on the internet telling you what to get without really understanding the whys, or without really understanding what you personally need. So I hope a video like this, it will be helpful to you. So now that we're at the end of this video, I also want to thank all of you guys for supporting me for basically an entire year on YouTube. I never thought I would make it through an entire year, but this has been really fun, and I can't wait to share more stuff, with you guys in the upcoming year. So if I don't make another video before 2022, I wish you all happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. And with that, I wish you all good health, take care, and clear skies, everyone. Bye.